June 18, 1944. Camp Hearn, Texas. The American guard didn't call a number. He called a name. The morning heat had already settled low and heavy over the camp, pressing down on the rows of wooden barracks as if the sky itself were leaning closer to listen. Dust clung to boots. Sweat darkened collars. The smell of coffee, real coffee, drifted faintly from somewhere beyond the fence, carried by a breeze that felt too warm to be trusted. Carl stood in line with the others, shoulders squared, eyes forward, hands resting flat against the seams of his trousers. He did not look around. He did not need to. He knew this moment. Roll call always came the same way. The men lined up. Names were stripped away. Numbers were spoken. Short, efficient, final. That was how it had been for years. A number could be shouted. A number could be misheard. A number could disappear without consequence. A name was different. In the German army, names were used early during training before the war hardened into routine. Later, names faded. Rank replaced them. Unit replaced them. Eventually, even rank dissolved into nothing more than function. You were what you carried, what you obeyed, what you survived. By the time Carl had crossed the Atlantic as a prisoner, he had already learned not to expect his name to survive the journey. The American guard stepped forward with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He was young, younger than Carl had expected, barely older than the war itself, it seemed. His uniform was clean. His posture relaxed in a way that felt unfamiliar. No rigid stiffness, no ritualized tension. Carl braced himself. Numbers, he thought. They will assign numbers here. New numbers. American numbers. The guard cleared his throat and glanced down at the paper. Carl Brenner. The sound landed wrong. Carl did not move. For a half-second his mind searched for translation, for context, for explanation. The name echoed in his head without settling like a word spoken in the wrong room. Carl Brenner, the guard repeated louder this time, his Texas accent flattening the vowels. The line around Carl shifted. A man behind him exhaled sharply. Somewhere to his left, boots scraped against gravel. Carl felt his chest tighten. His name, his real name, spoken aloud, unceremoniously, without warning. He raised his head before he could stop himself. Yes, he said, his voice thinner than he expected. The guard looked up, met his eyes briefly, and nodded. A pencil scratched a mark on the page. Nothing more. No pause. No reaction. The guard moved on. Another name followed, then another. Not numbers. Names. Each one spoken with the same casual certainty as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Carl's pulse hammered in his ears. He stared straight ahead, afraid that if he looked too closely the moment would dissolve. Afraid it might be corrected, retracted, explained away. This wasn't how prisoners were supposed to be counted. Around him the camp remained quiet. No laughter, no shouting, no sudden movement. The guard's voice moved steadily down the list, slicing the morning into clean, manageable pieces. The shock did not come like an explosion. It came like a misstep on familiar ground. The sudden realization that the floor was not where it had always been. Carl had prepared himself for many things since capture. He had prepared for hunger, though the Americans had surprised him there. He had prepared for labor, for confinement, for boredom that stretched endlessly from one identical day to the next. He had not prepared for this. In 1944, the war had reached a scale that no single man could hold in his head. America was fighting on two fronts across the Atlantic and Europe across the Pacific against Japan. More than 12 million Americans were in uniform drawn from farms, factories, towns like this one whose names Carl was still learning to pronounce. Ships crossed oceans daily, carrying men and machines in numbers that defied imagination. And with those victories came prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, mechanics, infantrymen, radio operators had been transported across the ocean, not into the chaos of bombed cities, but into the interior of a country that seemed impossibly large, impossibly calm. Texas alone felt wider than Carl's entire memory of Europe. Camp Hearn sat quietly amid fields and open sky far from any front line. The fences were real. The guard towers stood where they were meant to. But beyond them, life continued at a pace that felt almost insulting in its normalcy. That normalcy was what unsettled him now. The guard finished roll call, clipped the paper back onto his board, and stepped aside. Orders followed routine instructions about work details, about meal times, about where to stand and where not to. But Carl heard very little of it. All he could hear was his name. Not shouted, not reduced, simply spoken. As the line broke and the men dispersed, whispers began to surface, quiet, cautious, quickly smothered. "Did you hear? They used names. Why would they?" Carl said nothing. He did not trust the moment enough to discuss it. Kindness, he had learned, was often a prelude, a softening, a setup. There had to be a reason. Perhaps this was a psychological trick, a way to lower defenses before interrogation. Perhaps names would make them more compliant, more willing to talk, or perhaps it meant nothing at all. That possibility was the most disturbing, because if it meant nothing, if this was simply how things were done here, then everything Carl thought he understood about captivity would need to be re-examined. He walked back toward the barracks with the others, the sun climbing higher, the Texas sky unbroken and indifferent overhead. Behind him, the guard laughed quietly at something another soldier said. Ahead of him, the day stretched open, unremarkable, and waiting. And inside Carl, a question took root, unwelcome and insistent. Why would a country at war bother to remember a prisoner's name? The answer did not come. Not that morning, not yet, but the shock lingered steady and unresolved like a note left hanging in the air refusing to fade. Carl did not sleep well that night. The barracks were quiet in the way only crowded rooms could be breathing, layered over breathing boots stacked neatly beneath bunks, the faint creak of wood expanding and contracting with the Texas heat. Somewhere down the row, a man coughed and turned over. Another whispered a name in his sleep and fell silent again. Carl lay on his back, eyes open, staring into darkness that felt too orderly to be real. Kindness, he reminded himself, was never free. He had learned that lesson early. In the German army, individuality was a liability. During training, instructors drilled it out of them with precision. You were not Carl. You were not Franz or Otto or Heinrich. You were a rank, a role, a piece of a machine that functioned only if no single part believed itself irreplaceable. Names were useful only at the beginning before obedience was complete. Later, names weakened men. They invited memory, attachment, doubt. Carl remembered his first weeks in uniform standing in a muddy yard while an officer paced the line. When one recruit flinched as his name was called, the officer stopped, smiled thinly, and said, "You will forget that sound. We do not fight as names." The lesson was clear. Names belonged to homes, to childhoods, to women and kitchens and letters that smelled faintly of soap. War had no use for them. By the time Carl reached the front, his name had become something internal, rarely spoken. Orders did not require it. Survival did not reward it. And now, here it had been spoken again. That was what frightened him. The Americans had not taken his name by force. They had offered to give it back. Carl turned his head slightly and watched the shadow of a guard move past the narrow window rifle slung casually, boots crunching on gravel. No barked command followed, no insult, just routine. Routine was dangerous. The other men had felt it too. He could sense it in the way conversations had tightened after roll call, voices lowered not from fear of punishment, but from unease. No one celebrated. No one smiled. They waited. Waiting was familiar. In captivity, waiting became a skill. You waited for food. You waited for orders. You waited for bad news because good news had learned not to arrive unannounced. Carl sat up slowly and rested his elbows on his knees. His thoughts drifted backward across an ocean, across a continent breaking apart under weight it could no longer carry. Europe in 1944 was no longer a place, it was a condition. Bombs fell without warning. Cities lost their outlines. Rail lines twisted into useless knots. Hunger was no longer a crisis. It was a constant background pressure that shaped every decision. Letters from home had grown shorter before they stopped coming altogether. Not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no paper left to say it on. The war that had begun with marching songs now ended in silence and smoke. Carl remembered moving through villages reduced to shapes he barely recognized. He remembered children staring without curiosity, too tired even to beg. He remembered the sound of aircraft overhead, not close enough to see, never far enough to ignore. And beneath it all, the voice of the radio. America, it said, was chaos dressed as strength, a nation without discipline, a mongrel army held together by money and machines, not loyalty. American soldiers were told to be soft, undisciplined, cruel, when challenged incapable of order without violence. Captured by Americans, the broadcasts warned meant humiliation, starvation, experiments, disappearance. Carl had believed it, not because he wanted to, but because believing made the alternative unthinkable. If America was cruel, then suffering there made sense. If they were monsters, then fear was logical. The world remained coherent. But what if they were not? What if this calling names, serving hot food, issuing blankets without shouting was not a trick? The thought unsettled him more than any threat. Across the barracks, a man whispered, "They're preparing us," for what someone asked quietly. Interrogation came the reply, "They soften you first." Carl said nothing, but he did not disagree. It was a familiar tactic. He had seen it used before, though rarely with such patience. Break resistance not with pain, but with confusion. Make the enemy doubt his instincts. Make him question what he deserved. That night, Carl dreamed of numbers. They lined up along a chalkboard, endless and orderly. Each one erased as soon as it was written. When he reached the front of the line, the chalk snapped in half. The officer looked at him and said his name. Carl woke with his heart racing, the word still echoing in his ears. Morning arrived without ceremony. The sun rose bright and unforgiving as it always did. Breakfast followed. Real bread. Coffee strong enough to bite back. Men ate in silence, eyes flicking toward the guards, searching for signs of change. None came. Work details were assigned by name. Carl Brenner was sent to a maintenance crew repairing fence posts along the perimeter. He worked beside a man from Hamburg and another from Cologne. They spoke little, saving their breath for labor. Each time an American addressed him, they used his name. Not exaggerated, not emphasized, simply correct. It felt deliberate, and that, too, frightened him. In Europe, power announced itself loudly. Orders were shouted. Punishment was public. Fear was cultivated openly because fear was efficient. Here, power moved differently. It did not need to remind itself of its authority. That absence of cruelty, so intentional, so consistent, began to feel like pressure. Carl found himself rehearsing answers to questions no one had asked. He practiced silence. He practiced neutrality. He practiced resistance. At night, he and the others speculated in whispers. "They want us grateful," one man said. "They want us confused," another replied. "They want us talking." Carl listened and absorbed every theory, every rumor. None of them brought relief, because the fear was no longer of what might happen. It was of what already was. America did not look like the enemy they had been shown. The guards did not behave like conquerors drunk on victory. The system did not grind them down. It held them firmly, but without excess. And if that was true, if this kindness was genuine, then the war Carl thought he understood had been built on something dangerously incomplete. That realization was too large to face directly. So he did what he had been trained to do. He waited. He watched. And he told himself again and again that kindness was never free. Somewhere the cost would reveal itself. It had to. The explanation came 3 days later. Not announced, not assembled, not staged. It arrived the way most things did in this camp, quietly, as if it had always been there, and Carl had simply failed to notice. The prisoners were lined up again, this time outside the administrative building. The sun was higher now, sharper, pulling sweat to the surface of skin that had not yet adjusted to Texas. A light wind moved across the yard, carrying the smell of cut wood and machine oil. An American officer stepped forward. He was older than the guards. Not old, but settled, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested experience rather than carelessness. His uniform showed wear without neglect. When he spoke, it was not loud enough to demand attention, but it received it anyway. "You've probably noticed," he said, pausing, as if choosing not his words but his pace, "that we use names here." No one responded. Carl felt his shoulders tense. This was it, he thought. The turn. The explanation that would make sense of everything that had come before. The officer continued. "We don't erase names," he said. "We erase weapons." The sentence did not echo. It did not land with ceremony. It simply existed. The officer let the silence sit unforced. "You're prisoners of war," he went on. "Not criminals, not numbers. The war took your weapons. It didn't take your names. That was all. No applause, no lecture, no reference to democracy, to ideology, to right or wrong. No demand for gratitude." The officer nodded once as if concluding a routine briefing and stepped back. The line dissolved. Carl did not move for several seconds. The words repeated themselves in his mind not as rhetoric but as statement. Clean, precise, uninterested in persuasion. We erase weapons, not people. He returned to his barracks with the others, aware of a subtle shift in posture around him. Men who had been holding themselves rigid now moved with slightly less tension, as if the ground beneath them had proven unexpectedly solid. The system revealed itself slowly after that. Nothing dramatic changed. There was no sudden warmth, no indulgence. Rules remained rules. Fences remained fences. But names persisted. At meals, guards checked lists and called men forward by name. In work assignments, names were used again, paired with tasks, not judgments. When a man was sick, his name was written on a clipboard outside the infirmary door, not replaced by a number or a mark. It was consistent. That consistency mattered. Carl noticed that the guards did not stumble over the names. They did not shorten them into jokes or anglicize them into something easier. They learned them, slowly, imperfectly, but with effort. That effort unsettled him. In the world he came from, effort was reserved for efficiency or domination. Nothing was done without purpose, and purpose always served power. Here, power seemed to have no interest in proving itself. The camp ran like a machine that did not require shouting. Work began on time. Meals arrived on time. Supplies were issued on time. Mistakes were corrected without spectacle. When something broke, it was fixed. Carl watched American trucks arrive daily, heavy with materials, lumber, wire, equipment stamped with factory marks he did not recognize. Everything looked new. Everything worked. Beyond the fence trains passed regularly long chains of freight cars sliding across the horizon. He could hear them at night, their rhythm steady and indifferent. The war was everywhere, and yet here it felt contained. Carl began to understand something he had not been taught: to look for abundance does not need to threaten. In Europe, scarcity had shaped everything. Scarcity of food, scarcity of fuel, scarcity of time. Every order carried urgency because there was never enough to go around. Control was tight because loss could not be replaced. America was different. This country did not seem afraid of running out. Factories operated day and night. Machines replaced men without apology. If something failed, another took its place. The guards spoke casually about places Carl had never heard of: Detroit, Pittsburgh, California, as if production flowed from them endlessly reliably like water. Power here did not posture. It produced. The Geneva Convention was not mentioned often, but its presence was felt everywhere. Medical inspections were thorough. Complaints were recorded. Punishments, when they came, were measured and specific. Carl watched one afternoon as a guard corrected a prisoner who had stepped out of a line. The reprimand was brief, calm, done without witnesses. No humiliation followed. In the German army, discipline was public by design. Fear needed an audience. Here, discipline functioned quietly, as if shame were an inefficient tool. Carl did not know how to reconcile that. He found himself watching the guards when they thought no one noticed. They leaned against posts. They shared cigarettes. They joked with each other in low voices. They did not look at the prisoners with hatred. That absence was difficult to accept. Hatred would have made sense. Hatred would have fit the stories. Hatred would have allowed Carl to remain exactly who he had been trained to be. Instead, the guards treated the camp like a job to be done well. And jobs here were not emotional. One afternoon, while repairing a section of fence, Carl noticed an American soldier struggling to lift a post into place. Without thinking, he stepped forward and helped steady it. The soldier nodded once. "Thanks, Carl," he said, as if this were ordinary. Carl froze, hand still on the post. The soldier did not notice. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to. The name passed between them without ceremony, stripped of meaning and therefore full of it. That night, Carl sat on his bunk and removed the small paper tag he had been issued upon arrival. His name was typed neatly across it. Beneath it, his status. He had expected to feel resentment, seeing it again. Instead, he felt something closer to disorientation. No one here asked him to renounce anything. No one demanded confession or loyalty. The camp did not seek to change what he believed. It simply functioned. And in that functioning, something dangerous began to happen. Carl started to believe that this was not an act. The Americans were not trying to convince him of anything. They did not need to. Their strength did not require witnesses. He thought again of the officer's words. "We erase weapons." Carl had arrived without one. He would leave without one, but he would leave with his name intact. That realization stirred something unexpected in him, not gratitude, not yet, but respect. The kind that does not come from fear. The kind that grows quietly unnoticed until it is already too late to deny. For the first time since his capture, Carl allowed himself to consider a possibility he had been trained to reject. That power did not have to humiliate. And that this quiet, unremarkable order might be the most unsettling force he had ever encountered. Carl began to notice the rhythm before he understood it. It revealed itself not in grand moments, but in repetition, in the way days stacked neatly atop one another, each similar but never chaotic. The guards changed shifts at the same hours. Meals arrived with quiet regularity. Tools were counted, issued, returned. Nothing dramatic announced the order. It simply held. The American soldiers assigned to Camp Hearn were young. Younger than Carl had been when he first wore a uniform. Some still carried the loose energy of men who had not yet learned to fear silence. They joked among themselves. They complained about the heat. They spoke of home in a way that suggested home still existed intact. What struck Carl most was what they did not carry. They did not carry hatred. They did not look at him as an extension of an idea or as a representative of something abstract. There was no personal accounting in their eyes. No quiet scorekeeping. When they looked at him, it was with the same neutrality they gave fences paperwork the sky. It unsettled him more than hostility ever could have. Carl had been trained to expect judgment, to expect anger, to expect punishment delivered not because it was necessary, but because it was deserved. Here, none of that arrived. Instead, the guards behaved like men doing work that mattered, but did not define them. Their authority did not seem fragile. It did not need to be reinforced by displays of dominance. They enforced rules without insult. They corrected mistakes without spectacle. When discipline was required, it was precise, measured to the infraction, not inflated to make a point. Carl watched closely. On a work detail repairing storage sheds, a young guard dropped his clipboard into the dust. Papers scattered. For a brief moment, the yard paused, not out of fear, but expectation. In Germany, that would have been an opportunity. Someone would have been blamed. Someone would have been reminded where power lived. The guard cursed, quietly bent down, gathered the pages himself, and carried on. No one laughed. No one flinched. Power here did not require embarrassment. Carl began to understand that this was not leniency. It was confidence. The system did not fear being undermined. In the German army, discipline had been a performance. Orders were shouted because shouting made them real. Punishment was public because fear needed witnesses. Authority was constantly reinforced because it never trusted itself to last. Here, authority rested on something less visible. It rested on function. The camp operated like a piece of machinery built for endurance rather than intimidation. Every part knew its role. Every role fit into something larger. The guards did not improvise cruelty because they did not need to assert control. Control already existed. Carl noticed it in small ways. A broken hinge was repaired the same day it failed. Food shortages were addressed before they became visible. Medical checks happened on schedule, not in response to crisis. Complaints were logged, not dismissed. Nothing was wasted, not time, not effort, not people. Even the prisoners. Carl had expected captivity to feel like stagnation. Instead, it felt like being folded into a process that did not care who he had been, only what he could do. And that, too, was new. In Germany, identity had been everything until it was nothing. Loyalty had been demanded without question, then punished when it proved insufficient. The machine there ran on urgency and fear because it could not afford failure. Here, failure seemed anticipated, absorbed, corrected. Carl stood one afternoon watching trucks unload crates stamped with factory codes and dates. The volume alone was staggering. Each crate replaced something broken or consumed. Nothing looked irreplaceable. He thought of Europe, of rail lines destroyed faster than they could be repaired, of factories bombed into useless shells, of shortages explained away with slogans. America did not explain its strength. It demonstrated it. The guards spoke openly about their assignments ending soon, about transfers to other camps, other states. They trusted the system to continue without them. No one spoke as if everything depended on their personal sacrifice. That trust was visible everywhere. It appeared in the way orders were written rather than shouted, in the way men were trained to take over for one another without ceremony, in the way authority flowed downward without panic. Carl realized something quietly unsettling. This country did not rely on fear to function. Fear had been Germany's glue. Fear of failure, fear of punishment, fear of disobedience, fear of being singled out. Fear had kept men moving long after belief had collapsed. Here, belief seemed unnecessary. The Americans did not need to believe in their system. They lived inside it. Carl watched guards rotate duties without resentment. He saw disagreements resolved quickly without appeals to ideology. The work mattered more than the posture surrounding it. At night, when he lay awake, listening to trains pass in the distance, he imagined their routes stretching across a continent that did not seem to fracture under pressure. A place where production did not stop because it was inconvenient and unity did not require constant enforcement. No one told him this was better. No one needed to. The comparison formed on its own, slow and uncomfortable. Carl did not feel admiration, not yet. Admiration required choice. What he felt instead was displacement. Everything he had been taught to recognize as strength looked different now. The shouting, the rigid hierarchy, the obsession with obedience for its own sake. Those things had not created stability. They had hidden its absence. Here, stability did not announce itself. It functioned. Carl began to sense why the guards did not hate him. Hatred would have been unnecessary labor. The system did not require emotional investment to operate. It required participation. That realization followed him back to the barracks each night, growing heavier with familiarity. He thought of the slogans he had memorized, of the speeches broadcast across Europe promising inevitability, unity, destiny. None of those words repaired fences. None of them delivered food on time. None of them replaced broken parts. Here, no one spoke of destiny. They spoke of schedules. Carl did not yet know what to do with this knowledge. He did not feel converted or convinced. There was no moment of surrender, no dramatic reversal. Only a quiet awareness that two worlds had approached power differently. One had demanded belief and punished doubt. The other seemed content to function without either. And as the days passed, Carl understood that this difference unspoken, unadvertised, might matter more than any victory announced on the radio. He did not say this aloud. He did not need to. The comparison was already doing its work. The night came quietly. No sirens, no shouting, no sudden interruption to announce its arrival. Texas nights had a way of settling over the camp like a held breath. Heat bled slowly from the ground. The sky stretched wide and dark, indifferent to fences and borders. Crickets filled the gaps where human voices receded, their rhythm steady and unconcerned. Carl lay awake. Sleep had become lighter in America, not because he felt unsafe, but because nothing demanded his vigilance. There were no sudden orders in the night, no alarms signaling movement or danger. The absence of threat left his thoughts unguarded. That was when memory crept in. He stared at the wooden beams above his bunk, counting the small imperfections in the grain. Each knot, each split became an anchor, something solid to hold against the quiet. Around him, the barracks breathed. Men shifted, coughed, turned over. Somewhere down the row, a man murmured in his sleep and fell silent. Carl closed his eyes. He did not intend to sleep. The footsteps came without warning, soft, measured, the sound of boots on gravel approaching at an unhurried pace. Night check. Carl's body responded before his mind did. Muscles tightened. Breath slowed. The instinct was old and immediate. Night inspections in the German army had never been casual affairs. They came with flashlights, with clipped commands, with the unspoken promise that someone would be found lacking. The footsteps stopped near the door. Light spilled briefly across the floor as the door opened. A narrow beam moved through the room, not searching, simply confirming. Carl remained still, eyes closed. He listened. The guard's presence filled the doorway without pressing into it. There was no barked order to rise, no demand for acknowledgement. Then the voice came. Carl. Not shouted, not sharp, just spoken. Carl's eyes opened. For a moment he did not understand what he was hearing. The name drifted through the room as if it belonged there, as if it had always been part of the night's vocabulary. Carl the guard said again, quieter this time. The beam of the flashlight paused near his bunk, then shifted away. All good, the guard added almost to himself. The door closed. The footsteps receded. That was it. No command followed, no instruction, no threat, no reminder of status or consequence. Carl lay frozen, staring at the darkness. His heart did not race. It stalled. The name lingered in the air long after the sound had faded, pressing against something inside him that had been sealed shut for years. Carl. Not Gefreiter, not prisoner, not enemy, just Carl. He turned his head slowly toward the wall as if afraid that facing the room might shatter the moment. His throat tightened without warning. He swallowed once. Then again. Nothing changed. The room remained quiet. The men around him slept on, unaware that something irreversible had just occurred. Carl's chest began to ache. Not sharply, not violently. It was a dull pressure spreading outward as if something long compressed had finally been allowed to expand. He pressed his palm against his mouth. The sound escaped anyway. A breath caught halfway out, then another. His shoulders shook, once then stilled as if surprised by their own movement. Carl did not remember deciding to cry. There was no trigger he could identify, no single thought that opened the flood. It was as if the recognition itself, the simple acknowledgement of his existence, had loosened something too tightly bound to remain intact. Tears came silently, at first sliding down his temples and into his hair. He blinked them away, embarrassed by the instinct, by the vulnerability of it. He had not cried when he was captured. He had not cried when men beside him were killed. He had not cried when letters stopped coming. This was different. This was not grief. This was release. He had been prepared for pain, for hunger, for humiliation. He had been trained to endure those things with discipline and distance. He had not been prepared to be seen. Carl pressed his face into the thin pillow and breathed slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might draw attention. His body shook again, this time deeper, the motion spreading through his chest and into his arms. He was not afraid of being punished. He was afraid of being heard. The irony struck him faintly through the haze. In the world he came from, fear had been the tool used to maintain order. Men were made small so the system could appear large. Individuality was dangerous because it introduced variables. Here, no one had tried to reduce him. They had simply named him, and that had undone him. Carl's thoughts drifted backward, unbidden. He remembered the first time his name had been stripped of meaning. Standing in formation as a young recruit watching an officer point and assign numbers for a drill. The laughter that followed when someone hesitated, confused. The correction that came swiftly afterward. "Names are for children," the officer had said. "You are soldiers now." Carl had accepted that easily. At 19, he had wanted to belong to something larger than himself. He had wanted clarity, certainty, purpose. Over time, the system had delivered those things in abundance. Too much abundance. The certainty hardened. The purpose narrowed. The clarity erased anything that did not serve the machine. By the time Carl reached the front, he no longer thought of himself as an individual. He thought in units, in movements, in survival. That training had kept him alive. It had also hollowed him. The propaganda had filled the hollow with something else, an image of the enemy that made fear manageable. Americans were brutal, the broadcast said. Undisciplined. They hid weakness behind excess and cruelty. Carl had believed that, too. Belief had made sense of the world. But lying in this barracks, tears soaking into borrowed fabric, he understood that belief had also protected him from disappointment. Because if Americans were monsters, then anything they did could be explained. This could not. There was no cruelty here to absorb the shock. No violence to justify the pain in his chest. Only recognition. Only a guard doing his rounds using a name because that was how things were done. Carl's breathing slowed gradually. The tears came, less frequently replaced by a deep, aching fatigue. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and stared again into the dark. The old explanations no longer held. The propaganda he had absorbed cracked under the weight of a single quiet moment. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. Enough to let light through. Carl realized then that America did not need to destroy him to defeat him. It did not need to strip away his humanity to assert its power. It had simply outlasted his fear. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant survival could exist without humiliation. Terrifying because it meant everything he had endured might have been unnecessary. The guard did not return. The night passed as nights always did, slowly, steadily indifferent to private revelations. By morning, Carl's eyes were dry. His face betrayed nothing. He rose with the others, folded his blanket, and stepped into the day as he always had. But something fundamental had shifted. He carried his name differently now, not as a memory, not as a weakness, but as proof. Proof that power did not need to break a man to win. Proof that the war he thought he understood was not the only one being fought. And proof that the men guarding this camp, young, ordinary, unremarkable, were doing something no weapon could accomplish. They were letting him remain human. And that Carl understood as he walked toward roll call was the most devastating thing that had happened to him since the war began. Carl began to write again. Not letters, not reports, not the careful censored notes meant for someone else's eyes. This was different. He borrowed a small notebook from the camp library, its cover worn soft by other hands, its pages uneven at the edges. He did not ask permission. No one told him not to. At night, after lights out, he sat on his bunk and wrote by the dim glow that slipped in through the cracks between boards. He wrote slowly as if speed might cheapen the act. He did not write about the war. He wrote about himself. The first sentence came with difficulty scratched out twice before he allowed it to remain. They did not need to take my name to defeat me. He stared at the line for a long time after finishing it. The words felt too simple for what they contained, too clean. But that was the truth of it. Nothing in this camp had been elaborate. Nothing required explanation. Power Carl was learning did not announce itself through cruelty. It did not require spectacle. It did not need to humiliate. That realization unsettled him less now than it had at first. It had begun to settle. The days continued much as they always had. Work details rotated. Meals arrived. Roll call happened every morning. Names spoken with the same quiet certainty. The guards did not change their behavior because the prisoners changed theirs. The change came anyway. It showed itself in small ways. Arguments in the barracks faded more quickly. Men who once refused to cooperate out of principle now worked without complaint, not because they were broken, but because resistance no longer felt like proof of anything. The sharp edge that had defined captivity dulled into something quieter. Carl noticed that men began to speak of the guards not as a single mass, but as individuals. Someone mentioned the one from Oklahoma who played harmonica badly, but with commitment. Another joked about the tall Texan who squinted whenever he tried to pronounce German names. Names everywhere. The prisoners did not become loyal. They did not forget the war. They did not pretend they were anything other than captives. But something loosened. Hatred required constant effort. It needed reinforcement. It needed stories to justify itself. Here, those stories had begun to fail. Carl watched a man named Wilhelm, once rigid, once openly defiant, help a guard lift a crate without being asked. The exchange ended with a nod from each, nothing more. It would have been unthinkable months earlier. Not because it was forbidden, but because it would have meant admitting something dangerous that the enemy did not need to be feared to be respected. Carl wrote about that too. He wrote about how power felt different when it was not trying to convince him of its righteousness. About how rules, when applied evenly, lost their sting. About how being treated as a person made it harder to cling to the idea that the people across the fence were monsters. He did not excuse himself. He did not rewrite his past. He simply recorded what was happening. The Americans did not ask him to do this. They did not monitor his thoughts. They did not require transformation. They seemed unconcerned with what he believed, that Carl realized was part of the strength. This country did not need to reshape him in its image. It trusted itself to endure without demanding agreement. In Europe, systems had been built on constant affirmation. Loyalty, oaths, slogans, repetition until doubt itself became treason. Here nothing was repeated unnecessarily. The camp existed to contain, not to convert. and yet conversion was happening not to ideology, but to a different understanding of power. Carl thought often about what would come after. The war would end. It always did. Men would return to countries that barely resembled the ones they had left. Borders would shift. Flags would change. Stories would be told. He understood now that the war was not ending only on battlefields. It was ending here too. Every German prisoner who passed through an American camp would leave carrying something intangible. Not gratitude necessarily, not allegiance. Memory. Memory of how they were treated when they were no longer useful as soldiers. Carl imagined men returning to Europe telling stories that did not fit neatly into the narratives waiting for them. Stories about guards who did not shout, about meals that arrived regardless of behavior, about names spoken without irony. He wondered how those stories would be received. Perhaps they would be dismissed. Perhaps they would be resented. Perhaps they would be too uncomfortable to acknowledge. But they would exist, and that mattered. Carl closed his notebook one night and rested his hands on it, feeling the thinness of the pages beneath his palms. He understood then that this was not mercy he was witnessing. Mercy implied forgiveness. This was something else. This was confidence. Confidence that treating an enemy with dignity did not weaken a nation. Confidence that strength could afford restraint. Confidence that the future did not need to be protected by cruelty. The Americans guarding this camp were not philosophers. They did not speak in abstractions. They did not frame their actions as moral victories. They followed rules. They did their jobs. They went home at the end of their shifts. And in doing so, they demonstrated something Carl had never been taught to recognize. That victory could be quiet. That authority could be stable enough to allow humanity without fear. Carl did not know what kind of man he would be when he returned home. He did not know what Germany would look like or whether it would recognize him at all. But he knew one thing with certainty. The Americans had won something here that would not appear in any communiqué. They had shown him that power did not need humiliation, and that lesson once learned could not be unlearned. He wrote one final line before closing the notebook for the night. They did not conquer me by force. They let me see what strength looks like without fear. When he lay down to sleep, the thought followed him into darkness, calm and unchallenged. The war was still raging beyond the fences, but inside him something had already ended, and something else quiet, durable, and unarmed had taken its place. Carl returned to Germany in the autumn. The war had ended months earlier, but Europe was still catching its breath. Cities stood half-remembered streets, rearranged by force rather than design. Rail stations smelled of smoke and damp stone. Men moved through familiar places as if they were visitors, careful not to assume too much about what still belonged to them. Carl carried little with him. A small bag, a worn jacket, and a notebook he did not show anyone at first. Home was quieter than he remembered. Not peaceful quiet in the way a room becomes quiet after an argument that never fully resolved. His town had survived, though survival felt like a technical description rather than a comfort. Buildings stood. People returned. Life resumed without celebration. No one asked him what America had been like. At first, there were more urgent questions. Who had lived? Who had not? What could be rebuilt? What had been lost beyond repair? Carl worked. He listened. He learned how to speak again without uniforms shaping the conversation. He learned how to answer questions without orders attached. Years passed. When the questions finally came, they came quietly. From his children first. What was it like, they asked, not about the fighting, not about defeat, but about captivity, about the time between the end of one life and the beginning of another. Carl thought carefully before answering. He did not speak of tactics or ideology. He did not lecture. He did not frame his experience as exceptional. He spoke of names. He told them how American guards had called him Carl. Not once, not as a gesture, but every day, as if that was simply how the world functioned. He told them how no one had asked him to be grateful, how no one had tried to prove anything to him, how he had been treated not as a symbol, but as a person whose war had ended the moment his weapon was gone. His children listened confused at first. That was not the America they had been taught to imagine. It did not fit easily into the categories they knew. Later, when his grandchildren asked, Carl told the story again. He told it more slowly this time, not because his memory had faded, but because the meaning had deepened. He described the night a guard spoke his name in the dark. He did not embellish it. He did not dramatize the moment. He simply said that something inside him had broken open and that nothing had hurt him. His grandchildren grew up in a world shaped by different fears, different divisions. America was no longer distant to them. It was present in films and arguments and headlines that felt loud and endless. But when Carl spoke of America, he did not speak of power. He spoke of restraint. Years later, after Carl was gone, the notebook remained. It passed from hand to hand, carefully translated slowly, its pages worn thinner by touch than by time. In it, his family found no bitterness, no excuses, no attempt to rewrite history in his favor. They found observations, short sentences, plain words. They did not need to take my name to defeat me. They did not need to humiliate us to win. For his grandchildren raised far from Texas and even farther from the war, these lines carried a weight they had not expected. They began to understand that their grandfather's survival was not only physical. Something else had survived with him. A memory of a country at war that chose not to harden itself beyond recognition. Decades later, some of those grandchildren would travel. They would visit the United States, not as prisoners, not as enemies, but as guests. They would stand in quiet towns in Texas and the Midwest, places where old camps had faded into history, their fences dismantled, their barracks repurposed or erased. They would not find monuments. They would find normal life. And that somehow felt right. When they spoke of America, they spoke with a careful gratitude. Not the kind that demanded acknowledgement, but the kind that lived quietly inherited rather than taught. They understood that the men who guarded their grandfather were not saints. They were ordinary Americans, young, imperfect, shaped by their time. Many of them had gone on to fight. Some had not come home. But what they had done in those camps mattered. They had proven something about their country without saying it aloud. That strength did not require cruelty. That victory did not demand erasure. That even in total war restraint was possible. For Americans who listen to this story now, the legacy does not belong only to Carl. It belongs to the men who called his name without thinking twice, to the system that trusted itself enough not to break what it had already defeated, to a generation that understood something difficult and chose it anyway. This is not a story about perfection. It is a story about capacity. About what a country was capable of when it believed in its own stability strongly enough to treat enemies as human beings. Carl never claimed that America was flawless. He claimed something more precise, that once at a moment when fear would have been easy, it chose confidence instead. The question his family carries forward is not whether that choice made America great. The question is simpler, quieter, harder. We were capable of this once. Are we still?